Welcome to an introduction to inheritance. In this lecture, we'll be doing a couple of things. The first is that we'll be understanding exactly what this concept of inheritance is. Next, we'll be looking at sub and superclasses, and we'll finish off by taking a look at the variety of relationships that are associated with inheritance. So let's start off by understanding this important concept. Inheritance is an object-oriented programming concept that promotes software reusability. Now, the best way to explain inheritance is to draw an analogy to the daily routine of anybody. And this analogy is that inheritance is just like a father-son relationship. And the reason it's just like a father-son relationship is because it does exactly what a father-son relationship does. And that is that it's a relationship in which characteristics are passed down from the father to the son. And this is exactly what inheritance does. Inheritance allows you to pass down characteristics from one class to another. So in the case of inheritance, it's used in the software field, and basically what it does is rather than sending down traits like DNA from father to son, it sends down characteristics of a class. So all inheritance does is it lets you take characteristics of one class and give it to another. So it's just like inheritance, and it's just like a father-son relationship in real life. Now let's talk about subclasses and superclasses. So in the previous slide, we took a look at a very important relationship that helped explain inheritance to us. And that relationship was the father-son relationship. And as we talked about in the previous slide, we said that the father and the son represent individual classes in the Java programming language. Well, there's actually a more specific terminology for the father and the son. And that terminology is that the father is a superclass and the son represents a subclass. And basically what this means is that the father is the superclass, or the one that contains all the characteristics, and the son represents the subclass, which inherits all the characteristics. So one important thing to remember at all times when using the Java programming language and inheritance is that the subclass, yes, the subclass receives characteristics from the superclass, just like a son receives characteristics from his father. Now, there's two types of superclasses, and those two superclasses are direct superclasses and indirect superclasses. So, as you can see on the right, we have a small diagram where we basically have a superclass giving its characteristics to a subclass. And in this case, this is a direct superclass because there's a direct arrow between the subclass and the superclass. There's nothing in between or anything. They're directly related to each other. But now let's say that this superclass we have at the top of the diagram is actually inheriting a lot of its characteristics from another superclass, which is not shown, but it's actually above the existing superclass. Now this is what we would call an indirect superclass, because the subclass and this imagining an unseen superclass actually have an indirect relationship because the superclass seen in the diagram comes in between them. So in that way, there's a direct and there's an indirect superclass depending on if anything lies in between the relationship between the subclass and the superclass. Now, one important thing to note about Java programming language is it promotes single inheritance. And basically what that means is that a subclass can only receive the subclass can only receive its characteristics from one superclass. So basically, a subclass cannot go around receiving information from multiple superclasses. It has to choose one superclass and receive information from only that superclass. And what we see on the right here, as I mentioned earlier, is known as a class hierarchy, also known as an inheritance hierarchy, because it basically demonstrates inheritance. And so basically what we recapped was that there's a superclass and there's a subclass. And the subclass receives characteristics from the superclass, just as a son receives characteristics from his father. Now the last thing we'll be taking a look at is the various relationships that are associated with inheritance. And the first relationship associated with inheritance is the is-a relationship. And basically what this means is that let's say that we have a superclass called creature. And then we have a subclass called reptile. And let's say that this creature has a lot of characteristics like having a face, having eyes, and things like that. Now, when this subclass reptile inherits the creature's characteristics like having a face and having eyes, then we can say that a reptile is a creature. So basically that's what the is a relationship is, exactly what inheritance represents. Inheritance represents, what it represents is a subclass is a superclass. And obviously you would replace the word subclass and superclass by whatever the classes are. But basically what we know is that a reptile is a creature, and that's exactly how the relationship between inheritance works. Now another relationship is there's a has-a relationship. And this is actually not about inheritance, although it's often mistaken to be so. It's actually about instance variables. So let's say that we actually have a class called creature, and one of the instance variables of it is face, or face color, let's say. So then when because a reptile is a subclass of this creature superclass, the reptile automatically inherits the instance variable face. And then we can say that a reptile has a face, because that's one of the instance variables that the reptile class contains. And similarly, we can say a creature has a face. So the has-a relationship is used for when you have instance variables within a class. Now, some of the more important concepts of inheritance that we'll be going over later are overriding methods. And basically what this means is, let's say that the creature has the ability to jump. And let's say it can jump very high. But the reptile gets the ability to jump, but let's say the reptile jumps in a different way. So that's where we have to override methods. Basically, we have to change the way the reptile jumps so that's more like the way a reptile actually jumps rather than the way a creature jumps. And we've been always talking about how classes pass down characteristics to each other. Well, what are these characteristics? These characteristics are methods and variables that are passed down, just like we talked about, the face variable, or any methods like the ability to jump. All of these methods are passed down by from the superclass to the subclass. So these characteristics, as we know, characteristics are methods and variables in different classes, and these methods and variables are passed down from the superclass to the subclass. So in the real world, like characteristics like hair color and things like that are passed down. In the software world, methods and variables of a superclass are passed down to its subclass. We'll be getting into more detail about exactly what is passed down, what the rules are for inheritance a little bit later. But the important thing to remember is that inheritance is an object-oriented programming concept that helps us pass down characteristics from one class to another. And the class that receives the characteristics is a subclass, and the subclass receives characteristics from a superclass.